Dr. Hagel, it's a great honor to have you here. The viewers of my channel, if they are not familiar with you by name, they will be familiar with your work through the video essays that I've done, as one of your books, Stefan Hagel, Ancient Greek Music, A New Technical History, will be recognizable as one of the oft-cited sources in my video essays. It is still, to this day, I think, one of the most comprehensive, at least publicly available on the market, comprehensive guides to what we know of ancient Greek music. So definitely check it out if you're interested in the subject of ancient Greek music. Dr. Hagel, the context in which I have invited you here is specifically to talk about, as we were discussing, to talk about the degree to which we can reassess our understanding of ancient Greek music as a rigidly monophonic tradition. If we were to go 150 years ago in the past, probably due to the influences of developmentalist ideas of the more you go back in the past, the more simplistic music would have been. There would have been this idea of ancient Greek music as rigidly monophonic, almost in a lockstep unison sort of manner. Now we have a far more nuanced picture, I suppose, of our understanding of ancient Greek music.
Let me just start with a note on history, as you cited, 150 years ago. Perhaps 150 years ago, people would have been even far more open to attribute several voices to ancient music than people had been in the 20th century. So perhaps that rigidly developmental model of any useful sort of music was basically invented in the European Middle Ages is a bit more recent than a time that thought, well, ancient Greece must have had the highest music, and the highest music we know is about Bach and Beethoven. So therefore, they must have been sounding a lot like Bach and Beethoven, which is not a very sensible approach as well, but it's very different from that monophonic idea I still got when I started researching ancient music. So even soon starting with, let me show the book that I still regard as the most comprehensive guide. So quite old now, but I go to it whenever I look for comprehensive account of the most important references to a particular topic. Yeah, I didn't get the idea of a lot of heterophony from that book either, which has to do with the instruments that had been found back then, had been evaluated back then, among which there was hardly any complete pair of double pipes. What is it even? I mean, people probably have been singing all through human history and perhaps earlier. We have nicely singing animals as well, not directly in our line, so chimpanzees don't, so we might have invented that on our way towards Homo sapiens at some point. But yeah, when we think, we can do this on our own, only monophonically in some way. And when people sing together, even nowadays, without this very special tradition, some training, people would sing the same melody. So that's something that just is there, even is there in music culture, that it is that much informed by chordal harmony like ours. And then there's of course the question, if we now perform such a pure melody, is it really pure in the sense that as performers and as listeners to that melody, we don't in some way perceive the chordal harmony that the melody is structured upon, even without having heard it. So a lot is not even in the sound, but in the mind of the audience and the mind of the performer. And that makes it all the more tricky to go towards ancient music, because even when we have some material evidence, we cannot interpret it without access to the ancient mind, which in the Greco-Roman case we do have a lot through literature, but especially those questions which interest us today, well, they are treated in very few passages, often very confusingly. because ancient people knew what they were talking about. We don't. So what we definitely know is when they notated melody, they basically notated melody and not accompaniment. On the other hand, we know that there was accompaniment. We know that it was not just the same pitch as the singing voice or whatever, because especially in the case of double pipe, you get two distinct pitches at the same time. So you need to use that in some way, but we rarely get any discussion what it was. But as Plato expresses it, the music, along with the words, is by the composer poet. So that's a melody. The accompaniment, on the other hand, is not by the poet. The accompaniment is by the performer. So we just got whatever the difference in the music, we got the difference in the line that is drawn between what the original creative work by the composer is and what is added by each individual performer according to their capabilities.
So when we are talking about the written down melodies, we're talking effectively about a basic skeleton, but that skeleton in and of itself does not provide us with the full picture of the total experience of Greek music, essentially.
Yeah, notation never does. Even with the most meticulous modern attempts of notating anything, it never captures a full performance. That needs a recording. Notation has evolved in our Western music history from very simple melodic notation, which may have been accompanied by instruments in different ways as well, towards what we've seen in the 19th and 20th century, with increasingly adding all kinds of announcement of the composers. Yeah, we see a little bit of the same in ancient times, but nowhere getting anywhere near what we have nowadays. So we do have the oldest scores from the Hellenistic period, and they are several hundred years before the larger bulk of scores from the Roman period. And the Roman period abounds with additional what we call rhythmical notation signs, so clarifying how notes belong together hierarchically when they stand above the same syllable, or in instrumental music, where we have only very few pieces, how they belong together at all. While in the Hellenistic period, the scores we have, which are not that many, mostly leave the rhythmical interpretation to the understanding of the meter of the text.
Quaedis quod mihi basiationes tuae lesbia sint satis superque, quam magnus numerus libus arenae las arpi ciferis jacet curenis.
But it's just the old way, the same in texts. The ancient way of accentuating texts was just putting an accent where there might be a misunderstanding. But at some point, much later, Greek scribes began to put an accent on every word that deserves an accent. So scripts just get more redundant in a sense, less dependent on the understanding of the reader.
We were talking about this concept that a notated melody does not contain the full breadth of musical expression. When we look at these modal traditions of the East, and we can include also the body of mostly modal folk traditions of modern Greece in it, heterophony in a horizontal sense is the main driver of the expression. So, for example, if we are to take a melody that, bum 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 ba da da dum, a very possible explanation would be that maybe somebody would have embroidered the melody, going bum ba da 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 dum, ba da ba da ba da dum. That usually would be the model applied to melodic traditions found in the Middle East, even medieval Europe. We have an understanding that that kind of heterophony would have been dominant in the form of melodic embroidery, offsetting notes, two instrumentalists adding different ornamentations, but fundamentally following a single pitch sort of structure. There seems to be some evidence for that in ancient Greece in terms of melodic embroidery that follows the main melodic outline.
On the instruments, of course, yes. If you
Yeah.
accompany yourself, then obviously, as a trained performer, you'd add all kinds of things around the melody and whatever is the accompaniment. But for the song, there were very different styles, of course. We know of singing styles that would not follow a fixed rhythmical pattern, but we don't have anything of that. Perhaps we could think of something like that there, a tradition that is more akin to choral song, perhaps, which comes in more and less melismatic forms. But, well, the notation gives us a melodic line. To go to an understanding where we would say that the Greeks abstracted something very different to that melodic line, in order to understand it was performed not as that, but as something different, which could have been written down as well. It's not impossible, but it strikes me as not totally likely.
Interesting. So we are looking really at a concept that the vocalists were the ones who were maintaining perhaps the most skeletal form of the core of the written down melody was assigned to the vocalists, and it's the instrumentalists that would be doing more of the I suppose extra performance stuff that is not written down.
Well, that the sources somehow suggest it.
So it was really the job of the accompaniment, the instrumentalists, to bring the extra flourishes, let's say, to the musical expression. This does go with something that, for those who have watched my talk with Armand Dangour, we talked about the fact that something happened along the line from the time of Mesomedes to early Byzantine chant, where across the Mediterranean basin, even with early Christian chants, we see the rise of highly melismatic vocal forms, which do not seem to match with the ancient Greek practice due to the inherent limitation of the meter, basically. The meter demands this sort of, it would be difficult to imagine a Byzantine-like rendition of ancient Greek music, in my opinion, because of the inherent aspect of the meter and everything.
Which period Byzantine is it that you're talking about?
Let's say from the let's say 1300s onwards or a little before that, depending on who you ask, they will push it back to the 1000s. That is where I am comfortable seeing the melismata.
Mm.
Justinian's era, I'm not sure about that,
Yeah,
personally.
so that's half millennium later with
Yeah,
very strong different cultures being around, and
yeah,
that's not metrical, and
right.
that's what sets it apart from all the poetic texts we have melody fragments of, because these are all metrical. Perhaps that's the core of the difference. It's prose, so you don't need to respect the meter, so you can do lots of different things with this to get the same kind of complexity.
So the instrumentalists were the ones accompanying in a very sort of they would be the ones adding the extra flavor, the extra complexity. Now, of course, the immediate assumption, if we are following the sort of, I like to call it the monophonic until proven otherwise model, which is often applied to music history because monophony is more statistically dominant in humanity. So there's a tendency for some to go, well, the more careful route would be to go with only a horizontal line. So we can imagine the lyre or the aulos adding these extra melodic flourishes around the main melody. But what is far more fascinating is something that you also propose, is the idea that vertical simultaneity could have also very much been part of the vocabulary of the accompaniment of songs, basically. And I think one of the ways in which this becomes very obvious is not only the avlos, of course, we have two pipes, but even the lyre. We know that the strummed technique was the main technique for the Greeks.
The Greek way is to have a massive plectrum in the right fist and to strum. So, and very often we find depictions where people are strumming right across.
And it's difficult to imagine them blocking every string and only leaving one. It just, at a fundamental level, it strikes as it can be very odd. So how would that work?
Yeah, well, and with 7 strings, it might still be possible to do that, but with 9, it's almost impossible, and with 11 strings, it's absolutely impossible because you don't get enough fingers on one hand. So yes, if you use block and strum technique, then we definitely get more than one pitch at one time. And we get a much stronger rhythmical component. So it's so different from the modern cinematic idea of Peter Ustinov holding the lyre on one arm and plucking it with the other hand, as if any meaningful instrument would have ever played just with one hand, unless you had something to do with the other hand, for instance, playing a second instrument. That's possible, but otherwise, yeah, there's two hands for any kind of music. But I think here we need to go back to the Oriental sources, and in that case, not as we used Oriental up to now, which meant something from the Abbasid court on to the High Middle Ages, but the thing we get in the cuneiform sources in the second and first millennium before the Common Era, because the evidence for vertical thinking on pitch combinations seems even stronger there than in what we have in most of the Greek sources. I don't know whether you've covered this in any of your other.
So I believe you were talking about the Hurrian tablets and the dichordal nature of what seems to be implied there.
The evidence, the basic evidence is that all that system of describing musical notes, which we have, and that several tablets of different kinds that range from the earlier second millennium up to the mid first millennium about. And they all form a coherent picture. And they're based on 14 terms which stand for couples of strings. Now this is important. It's not couples of pitches, it's actually a couple of strings. So the whole system, if you come to it from a theoretical perspective, it looks totally confusing. If you come to it as a lyre player or a harp player for that matter, it is absolutely meaningful. Take a lyre. So each and every of those strings, except the central string, would have been retunable in the ancient Mesopotamian modal system. Each, except the central strings, may have had one of two different pitches, differing by a semitone, as we call it. That's not in the ancient Mesopotamian thinking. But they had terms for pitch pair, string pairs. And each string pair might play a fifth, a fourth, a third, a minor or major third, or a tritone, something of that. But whether this was a minor third, a major third, a minor sixth, a major sixth, the term would be the same, because in one tuning at one time, you only needed to know which two strings play, obviously, together, because otherwise that whole system would not make a lot of sense. And with those terms, you could describe a lot. You could make the terms of the 7 modal scales, because each tuning starts with a different pair of strings tuning them, fifth and fourth. Eminently practical, you get that set of terms and you can talk to each other about how to harmonize something, how to tune something. It's basically all you need in a small orchestra. If the music has an underlying dichordal harmony, so if the music is based not only on a melodic line, but on a melodic line that is somehow perceived to proceed in an accompaniment in pairs of functional pitches. So those are not absolute pitches. Those are pitches, functional pitches within the octave. And we get this. If you retune that note, you also retune the note at the octave, and that still gives you the same term for dichords. So that's a very, very early, that's the earliest theoretical information we got in ancient music, and it's built on the idea of two strings that belong together. And
Now, my question is there a sort of theoretical framework where this string is always comes with this string. Would that be what happens?
That's not yet here, no.
Okay,
That's not so many combinations. You have terms for 14 combinations. Each string has a combination for the fourth, for the fifth, and for the two kinds of thirds. It
interesting.
means with 7 notes in the octave, this gives 14 permutations.
Interesting. So
And
14 permutations of which harmonizing dichord comes with which main string,
yes,
basically.
functional pairs. We don't really have pair names for seconds, which would be the same as seventh. There has been speculation that other terms might denote this, but that's far from clear. And we have those very famous Hurrian hymns from the middle of the second millennium. And there we have the single instance where this kind of terminology was consistently used to notate the music of a song. And we can read that. We can't read the song. I don't think that the melody was written down. The melody was known to the singer. What we have is basically first the text, then a line, and under the text, without relation to the words of the text, we get the chords. Not chords of 3 notes or 4 notes like in modern guitar notation, but of 2 notes. So we don't know how to perform that. We don't know the rhythm. We only get chords and numbers that might mean repetition or whatever. So what we can read from this is a basic kind of harmonic progression, which seems to make sense. We can feel, we can do statistical analysis of this. And yeah, there's a culture that is quite understandable. And this indeed is a culture not of the single performer that travels from court to court, from festival to festival, who tries to outshine every competitor, but that's a culture of orchestras playing for kings, playing in temples. So that's a musical culture where playing together several instruments was paramount. And that's a big difference to the Greek world, where the focus is on the individual performer. So the drivers of Greek evolution were the poet-composers who tried to be those who would win the most lasting fame and would win the most prestigious prizes. And the focus is different. Then it's not unnatural that the two kinds of notations were so different. So the Mesopotamian notation, if we can call it like that, well, that's Syriac notation, if you prefer, notated what an orchestra needs. There may be one singer, they know the melody, but everybody needs to know the basic harmonization, or otherwise it will sound terrible.
So we are also looking very possibly at a reality of dichordal harmony in the Greek tradition, not only on the lyre, but we can look at the aulos also later. So if we look at the lyre, for example, with the block and strum technique, how would this manifest itself, this sort of dichordal harmony?
If we have, well, this is a 9-string lyre, so that's best suited for that Roman period school music or late classical music. The sources for the earlier classical period suggest 7 strings, and that's what the texts say, and the texts quite early even have forgotten how 7 strings would be tuned. But we got one source, Philolaus, from the 5th century, which clearly tells us that the basic tuning of the 7 strings was an octave structured in 5th and 4th. And then there are 3 strings in between, which you can tune in any way to give you different kinds of harmogai modes, whatever you would like to call them. The tuning is not the mode, of course. You can use the same tuning for different modes.
Yeah. Also, I want to note for our viewers, just so there's no confusion, when we use the term, so far we've used the term harmony in the modern sense and not in the ancient Greek sense. So in terms of,
Yes,
just a note for our viewers terminologically. So please continue.
yes, absolutely. So that source calls this a harmonia. So this perfect structuring of an octave that is harmonically structured. And then with 7 strings, if you have the octave up and down, then you have clearly a dominance of that note because it's there twice. And it reinforces harmonically those notes which stand in the simplest relation to it, which are the 5th down and the 4th down from the extremes, which fits in very well with all the notions in early texts that the central string, the mese, is somehow most important in whatever way, because this is just a 5th from the upper note and the 4th from the lower note. So you get some notes which automatically, just by virtue of the tuning itself, are bound to have stronger modal prominence. And so you'd probably use combinations that use those major notes for resting notes, starting notes, final notes, and the other notes more for intermediate, less final, suspensive, that kind of. So that would be the typical triad of Hypate, Nete, and Mese. And then you could play around, but would probably always end up with something that fits nicely with the boundary.
Is there any understanding of a systematic reasoning of which notes would be harmonized with which? Do we have an understanding of a sort of a grammar, basically, of them systematizing this?
Yeah, no, we have basically nothing in the ancient writings. I suppose there may have been something, but it was of no interest to the medieval scribes, so that was not copied like hardly any technical things were copied if they didn't help you to heal your horses or sack a city. But we have one tantalizing passage in an early Roman period essay that, and the passage is more or less, it seems, a verbatim quotation from Aristoxenus, so from something in the late classical period. And the topic is not, hey, posterity, I'm going to tell you how we play the aulos, but the topic is very specific, arguing that the ancients knew more pitches than they used in their melodies. So the thrust of the argument is, nowadays we use all pitches in every context, but if you want to preserve the more pure ethos of a particular musical style, you should limit your pitches to a certain set.
Okay.
And Aristoxenus goes to argue that the earlier composers, they were not just ignorant of all the pitches there were, but they used the pitches, but they didn't use them for the melody, they used them only in the accompaniment, which is an interesting stance. And here he gives specific examples for the aulos. And he gives several pairs of notes where he says, this note is not in the melody, but it's used in the accompaniment in consonance with that melodic note, in dissonance with that melodic note, and in dissonance with that melodic note. So we get a small list. So all we know is that we probably have a set of extra accompanying notes in one particular musical style, and each of these has probably a complete enumeration of notes it could accompany.
Something close to what we seem to see in the Mesopotamian system, where they also had these permutations of pairs. What's interesting here is that, so I have two questions regarding this. Firstly, so we have this concept of the consonances and the dissonances, right? This concept of pairs that sound together well and they're dissonant. Now, those are not necessarily our consonances and dissonances of Western tonal harmony. I would guess that there were differences, right?
Well, we all agree that octaves are nice consonances and may even deserve a separate name because somehow the notes are functionally identical. That's something that was clear for the Mesopotamians. That's something that Ptolemy emphasizes a lot and which doesn't come across that clearly in the classical Greek tonal system because the note names for notes in octave apart don't reflect each other in the two octave system, but they're built on different ways. But basically it's clear and modulations go up to modulation by an octave and then you've covered everything. So it's clear for all the periods. Then there's the fifth and the fourth, which are universally acknowledged as consonances, and everything else is somehow not. So that might count as a diaphonia or something. So there may be triple classifications or just double classification. That depends on the author or the period. It's not always clear what is what, but it's clear that somehow there's tension in those combinations. And the most perfect solution to those tensions would be unison.
So this is where a quote I have the passage by Martin L. West here in his book that you showed. So he's talking about the Orestes papyrus, which has these extra notes underneath the notes. Many have interpreted them as
Yeah.
possibly being these harmonizing notes. And he adds, the author of the Pseudo-Aristotelian Problem, 1939, speaks of aulos accompaniments, which use discords but finish in unison with the vocal line. And he says that they give more pleasure by the ending than displeasure by the preceding divergences. I mean, this seems like it's hard to read it as anything other than them clearly using dissonances in an almost, perhaps not exactly like jazz, but something close to that. This idea that by using dissonant chords and then finishing in unison, we have that seems to be a very clear case of that.
Yeah, that's absolutely a clear case. And the pseudo-Plutarch passage I was talking about just before also explicitly mentions a major second as one of the accompaniment intervals. So it becomes almost as dissonant as it can. It's not a semitone, but at least it's a major second, which is not quite as dissonant as it can get, of course. There are music cultures which employ major seconds in parallel as well.
My second question was, Aristoxenos was equating this dichordal, let's call it, way of accompaniment. He was saying that is something that it seems that he's equating that to an older or more archaic style, that back then, it's something that they were doing more. Did I get that correctly?
Well, he's talking about an ancient style because his argument is about what was ancient music like. So we cannot deduce from that it was different in the music of his period or anything. But what he needs is a style that was firstly commonly acknowledged as ancient, and secondly easily available because people played this all the time. And this was just a traditional sacrificial aulos air, which you probably heard on an everyday basis in the environment in which he was writing. And we can't deduce anything from difference to this. And everything may have been valid to all kinds of music or not.
The main melody, of course, it was the main melody as it was, but then you have these consonances, dissonances, and now we don't know exactly if one style preferred dissonances throughout and then ending in unison. If one preferred mostly consonances, that is something that we can't necessarily pinpoint, I would guess, right?
Yeah, and those dissonances in the problem would evidently include all kinds of third and sixth, sound very consonant to Western ears. They were not outright symphonoi, so the word of which our consonants is just a Latin translation, But the general definition is that the consonance is where the two notes blend together in a way that they form a new whole, and you don't sort of hear the individual notes still. While in all other kinds, you still hear the individual notes that sound together. So it's not about it sounds unpleasant, something like that, but it's of how well they blend. So crasis, blending, is the key concept here.
And so the dissonances are the ones that, according to them, didn't blend audibly.
The mixture of those, you'd still perceive the two components.
Right.
In the blend of a consonance, you'd rather hear the emergent whole.
And what's fascinating, what makes it somewhat foreign to us, is the fact that if we go with the reading of the Orestes Papyrus, having those notes now, that's in the enharmonic mode, in one of the enharmonic genus. So to use a sort of a popular terminology, I mean, we're looking at a sort of, I don't want to say microtonal harmonization, but I'm sure my viewers will understand what I mean by this. This was not because we think of, in our Western mindset, we think of harmony as having to come from a diatonic basis. This was applied to all the genera, whether the enharmonic, whether the chromatic.
Absolutely. Whether the Orestes fragment is enharmonic or not, we don't know that. We hope it is, because it would be the only bit of enharmonic music we have. So we really hope it is. But even if it's not, we know there was enharmonic music on the aulos, and you got two pipes, and you need to play the quarter tones, so you need to accompany this somehow. But then that intermediate note in the enharmonic, so the slightly raised note, it's not that easy to accompany. All the other notes would rather easily form fifths, fourths, octaves, thirds with other notes. The in-between note rather needs another in-between note. So it doesn't easily find a companion.
There must be reasons that the enharmonic went out of use, as Aristoxenus was very sad about, but something must have happened for the enharmonic to go out of use eventually.
That's an interesting question. Yes, why did it go out of use? So Aristoxenus says that the diatonic variant is going out of use, which may be a misrepresentation of historic reality, because the earlier sources he himself cites seem to say that the earliest variants of enharmonic probably had a wider enharmonic. So the dichordal may have been rather young and had to do perhaps with new instruments. It's a murky question. Where we definitely see it's gone out of use is Gaudentius, but that's late antiquity. And in between, there's Ptolemy, who says that it's evidently not really as familiar as the others, but it's not that far out of use that he wouldn't propose a mathematical model for it that his supposed readers, might still have been able to ascertain. And after all, if those very traditional sacrificial tunes were enharmonic, are they likely to have been forgotten very soon? So those are things that stay around. As long as you have the ancient style instrument, at least, you might have a remnant of that. That doesn't mean that ordinary people would ever have sung enharmonic. Even in the earlier sources, it's ascribed not to people, but to professions, to the actor, the opera singer. That would be the typical person to sing enharmonic.
When you yourself are playing the lira and you're strumming and there are these note combinations, what we have to do is speculate on what those note combinations would have been based on the textual evidence, from what I understand.
Well, the textual evidence plays a role, but here we must rather look at the specific melodies as such. So if we have those different hymns by Mesomedes, which have different modes in the same tuning, evidently the tuning doesn't help us. The texts don't help us. They don't even really talk about how the tunings were used. So we need to look at the melodies themselves, because the melodies, as melodies, also establish tonal hierarchies, show us which notes are important, show us in consonant leaps, as opposed to more conjunct motion of melodies, which consonances were important, which were not. And from this, we can get, if the melody is sufficiently long, we can get an impression of how this works. Or we get similar melodies in different fragments, then we can bundle them together into a statistical analysis on them. And then I think we have a good basis to assess harmonic domains and contrasting harmonic domains. So moving between 2 or even 3 different subsets of notes that work together.
And how does that express itself on the aulos? We looked at the lyre, of course, the strumming. Now we're dealing with 2 pipes essentially played at the same time. So how does it express itself on the aulos?
Yeah, the aulos is a fascinating animal. We start with an early pair like this one. So that's a printed reproduction of the Posidonia aulos. And so you got 2 pipes which overlap to a good degree. Aulos pairs never have the same scale for both hands. So you always get the difference. So they are not made for being played in unison at all. If you want a double pipe to play in unison, you tie them together, you drill the same holes, and you play them overlapping with your fingers, like an argul, sumara kind of thing. These are individual pipes, so you got the left hand and the right hand pipe. And the overlap here is just shifted by a single step. So it's not like they would mostly play in fifths and fourths, because then you'd have a much greater shift between the hands. But if we just had the instrument and had no other information about the musical culture, we would probably deduce that the typical scale was something like Rast scale, and that the typical way of playing them was in steps of something like a major second. None of this is true, but we need the texts for that. So if you play just the notes by releasing one finger after the other, you don't get a valid Greek scale. Aristoxenus outright excludes such a scale. So you always need to bend to half hole at least 1-2 holes on a hand to get a valid scale. But you can get different valid scale by half-holing differently. One pipe. The other pipe, so they might play in unison something like this here. Which is not a scale. If you want an ancient Greek scale, you need to play at least like and then you get diatonic with a real kind of semitone or even a small semitone. And yeah, if you want to play them together, you basically need to invent, like they did in antiquity. And even that obvious dissonance must have been meant to play, otherwise there would be no gain in having those 2 top notes on the 2 pipes if they never play together. Because every other interval you could play with notes from the 2 different pipes. So seconds were part of the game, even in that earliest period. So the natural way to understand it is that one pipe here played melody and the other pipe played accompaniment, cruises. the striking, a term taken over from the lyre kind of instrument. So something that gives you, also gives you some rhythmical accentuation probably. And there we don't get any more information apart from we have in the language itself. The idea that the second pipe evidently gave striking, and striking is related to rhythmical modification. And there's also the idea, modern idea, but bolstered by quite a few passages, all of them tantalizingly unclear, that the component would always be higher than the melody, which is very unusual for modern ears because we tend to think that the higher hand on the piano plays the melody and the lower hand plays some bass Alberti accompaniment, something like that. Yeah, not like here. So on the aulos, at least, it seems they had the idea of rather the lower thing is the melody. I mean, the aulos, there's probably different ways of using it. You could have playing in parallel, really, like the Aristoxenus passage we were discussing, sort of suggests. You could keep for a while a drone note on one pipe and play on the other. You can play with alternating drone, or you could play basically heterophonically, polyphonically. All this is possible. All this was probably done in some style or other. But we also have those triple pipes from Sardinia, which suggest, again, a very different kind of music, where as soon as you got the drone note, you inevitably have that contrast between a basic line of harmonic structure and everything else contrasting, which you don't necessarily have on an aulos because everything can sound nice or can sound dissonant. You don't, nothing suggests that one note is more important than another note. Only what you do with it suggests that. But yes, some conversation between the pipes with dichords or with rest on one pipe and the other pipe talking. Some mixture of that, I think, is what they most probably did.
I think that's a very important discussion to have because as we have established, there was such a long-standing tradition of this model of everything had to be utterly monophonic until organum was invented in the Middle Ages and everything, that it still is very, you'll find it in the zeitgeist of pop culture still, interestingly enough. You'll still have people saying, well, it's impossible that ancient Greek music could have had any kind of dichordal or harmonic or vertical dimension. So I think it's a very important discussion to have because imagining that the earliest notated music of Mesopotamia might in fact have had a vertical dimension to it, a chordal dimension to it. This is an important discussion to have because it really undoes, I think, the traditionalist narrative, if you will, of this simplistic development of music that monophony first and then polyphony and et cetera, et cetera.
And actually, you don't need a melody. So that comes from my experience first with Homer, but then also with other bits of ancient poetry set to fixed shapes. When I do Homer in a kind of dichordal harmony performance, all the verses will have their individual melody because the melodic patterns need to adjust to not only to the meter, but to the accents of the words and to the sentence structure, metrical structure. But when I follow a kind of chordal pattern, I have this in mind and I will automatically improvise a melody that fits the pattern of the lyre. So I don't go to Sappho with a melody in mind, but with what I do on the lyre in mind. And then the melody gets sort of first improvised and then over time it might become more fixed, but there will still be variants. So I think that may be very close to what we are observing in the Mesopotamian Syriac tradition, that we do have the pattern of dichords and then the singer, if it's one, they might do whatever they like. It will fit in with that. Even if there's more than one singer. If they have a general idea, they can do variants. The variants will fit in with the dichordal pattern, so it will create beautiful sounding music that, yeah, that only needs 14 terms to use to be fixed, or if you like, 14 hand gestures to be improvised by a conductor. Even that is possible. We can start with dichordal harmony, and melody may come by itself.
Well, Dr. Hagel, I think we have looked at all of the topics at hand today. I want to thank you immensely for the opportunity to interview you.